video of reading Aldous Huxley's Island. Look at me trying to make it all like a serious video intro for you. It's because I'm putting it up on my YouTube channel, so you never know. Random strangers might pass by and like it, and then because of ego and vanity, I'll have to redo them all that kind of thing. But you don't object to me double dipping, I hope, in this sense. Anyway, right. So chapter 4, I think, or is it chapter 3? That's halfway through chapter 3. Okay. Good, said Dr. MacPhail. Slipped him onto it. Carefully. A minute later, the little procession was winding its way up the narrow path between the trees. Mary Sorrigini was in the van, her grandfather brought up the rear, and between them came Murugan and Vijaya at either end of the stretcher. From his moving bed, Will Farnaby looked up through the green darkness as though from the floor of a living sea. Far overhead, near the surface, there was a rustling among the leaves, a noise of monkeys, and now it was a dozen hornbills hopping like the figments of a disordered imagination through a cloud of orchids. Are you comfortable? Vijaya asked, bending solicitously to look into his face. Will smiled back at him. Luxuriously comfortable, he said. It isn't far, the other went on reassuringly. We'll be there in a few minutes. Where's there? The experimental station. It's like Rothamsted. Did you ever go to Rothamsted when you were in England? Will had heard of it, of course, but never seen the place. It's been going for more than 100 years, Vijaya went on. 118 to be precise, said Dr. MacPhail. Laws and Gilbert started their work on fertilisers in 1843. One of their pupils came out here in the early 50s to help my grandfather get our station going. Rothamsted in the tropics, that was the idea. In the tropics and for the tropics. There was a lightening of the green gloom, and a moment later the litter emerged from the forest into the full glare of tropical sunshine. Will raised his head and looked about him. They were not far from the floor of an immense amphitheatre. 500 feet below stretched a wide plain, checkered with fields, dotted with clumps of trees and clustered houses. In the other direction the slopes climbed up and up, thousands of feet towards a semicircle of mountains. Terrace above green or golden terrace, from the plain to the crenellated wall of peaks, the rice paddies followed the contour lines, emphasizing every swell and recession of the slope with what seemed a deliberate and artful intention. Nature here was no longer merely natural. The landscape had been composed, had been reduced to its geometrical essences, and rendered by what in a painter would have been a miracle of virtuosity, in terms of these sinuous lines, these streaks of pure bright colour. What were you doing in Rendang? Dr. Robert asked, breaking a long silence. Collecting materials for a piece on the new regime. I wouldn't have thought the Colonel was newsworthy. You're mistaken. He's a military dictator. That means there's death in the offing, and death is always news. Even the remote smell of death is news, he laughed. That's why I was told to drop in on my way back from China. And there had been other reasons which he preferred not to mention. Newspapers were only one of Lord Aldehyde's interests. In another manifestation, he was the Southeast Asia Petroleum Company. He was Imperial and Foreign Copper Limited. Officially, Will had come to Rendang to sniff the death in its militarised air, but he had also been commissioned to find out what the dictator felt about foreign capital, what tax rebates he was prepared to offer, what guarantees against nationalisation, and how much of the profits would be exportable, how many native technicians and administrators would have to be employed. A whole battery of questions. But Colonel Dipper had been most affable and cooperative. Hence that hair-raising drive with Murugan at the wheel to the copper mines. Primitive, my dear Farnaby, primitive. Urgently in need, as you can see for yourself, of modern equipment. Another meeting had been arranged. arranged, Will now remembered, for this very morning. He visualised the Colonel at his desk, a report from the Chief of Police. Mr. Farnaby was last seen sailing a small boat single-handed into the Parlour Strait. 2 hours later, a storm of great violence, presumed dead. Instead of which, here he was, alive and kicking, on the Forbidden Island. "They'll never give you a visa," Joe Aldehyde had said at their last interview. "But perhaps you could sneak ashore in disguise. Wear a burnous or something, like Lawrence of Arabia." With a straight face, "I'll try," Will had promised. "Anyhow, if you ever do manage to land in Parlour, make a beeline for the palace. The Rani, that's their Queen Mother, is an old friend of mine. Met her for the first time 6 years ago at Lugano. She was staying there with old Viogeli, the investment banker. His girlfriend is interested in spiritualism. They staged a séance for me. A trumpet medium, genuine direct voice, only unfortunately it was all in German. Well, after the lights were turned on, I had a long talk with her." "With the trumpet?" No, with the Rani. She's a remarkable woman. You know, the crusade of the spirit." "Was that her invention?" "Absolutely. And personally I prefer it to moral rearmament. It goes down better in Asia." We had a long talk about it that evening, and after that we talked about oil. Parlour's full of oil. Southeast Asia Petroleum has been trying to get in on it for years. So have all the other companies. Nothing doing. No oil concessions to anyone. It's their fixed policy. But the Rani doesn't agree with it. She wants to see the oil doing some good in the world. Financing the crusade of the spirit, for example. So as I say, if ever you get to Parlour, make a beeline for the palace. Talk to her. Get the inside story about the men who make the decisions. Find out if there's a pro-oil minority and ask how we could help them to carry on the good work." And he had ended by promising Will a handsome bonus if his efforts should be crowned with success. Enough to give him a full year of freedom. No more reporting. Nothing but high art, and he had uttered a scatological laugh as though the word had an S at the end of it and not a T. Unspeakable creature. But all the same he wrote for the unspeakable creature's vile papers, and was ready, for a bribe, to do the vile creature's dirty work. And now, incredibly, here he was on Palanese soil. As luck would have it, Providence had been on his side, for the express purpose, evidently, of perpetrating one of those sinister practical jokes which are Providence's speciality. He was called back to present reality by the sound of Mary Sorgini's shrill voice. "Here we are." Will raised his head again. The little procession had turned off the highway and was passing through an opening in a white stuccoed wall. To the left, on a rising succession of terraces, stood lines of low buildings shaded by peepul trees. Straight ahead, an avenue of tall palms sloped down to a lotus pool, on the further side of which sat a huge stone Buddha. Turning to the left, they climbed between flowering trees and through blending perfumes to the first terrace. Behind a fence, motionless except for his ruminating jaws, stood a snow-white humped bull, godlike in his serene and mindless beauty. Europa's lover receded into the past, and here were a brace of Juno's birds trailing their feathers over the grass. Mary Sorgini unlatched the gate of a small garden. "My bungalow," said Dr. MacPhail, and turning to Morrigan, "let me help you to negotiate the steps."